staring military defeat in the face. By a massive effort, the revolutionaries had turned the tables on the Prussians and Austrians. At the Thermopylae of Valmy on the 20th of September 1792, Dumouriez decisively defeated the Prussians. By the end of the year, the new armies of revolutionary France had invaded the Rhineland and the Austrian Netherlands, officially exporting the ideology of the revolution, but actually in search of loot to shore up the value of the tottering assignat. January 1, 793 was a key date in the revolution, for Louis XVI was executed and Danton declared the doctrine of France's natural frontiers. In line with these national aspirations, the Revolutionary Executive or Convention declared war on England and Spain. The French plan for an expedition against Sardinia was a sign of the new expansionist policies. Sardinia had an obvious strategic importance in the Mediterranean, and the invasion was meant to demonstrate France's newfound power. And to overawe Florence and Naples, there were additional objectives of seizing the island's corn and alleviating shortages in the south of France. Admiral Truget arrived in Ajaccio with a large body of regulars and a flotilla of ships, intending to incorporate the Corsican volunteer battalions in his force. On the way over from France, there had been tension between soldiers and sailors. To this was now added acrimony and bad feeling between the regulars and the Corsican volunteers. Paoli, who was now close to an overt breach with revolutionary France, bitterly opposed the venture but was shrewd enough to see that Truget's regulars might combine with Napoleon's volunteers to depose him if he came out openly against the expedition, especially since there were rumors that Truget was already a fast friend of the Bonapartes and was besotted with the 16-year-old Elissa. He therefore schemed to denude the island of Napoleon's volunteers, while secretly taking steps to ensure the ultimate failure of Truget's project. Because of the ill feeling between regulars and volunteers, Paoli persuaded Truget to mount 2 attacks. The main assault under Truget would be at Cagliari, and a diversionary thrust would be made against La Maddalena, the largest of the 11 Buccinari islands that lie between Corsica and Sardinia. For the diversionary attack on La Maddalena, with its 2 forts, Paoli successfully intrigued to have his nephew Colonna Sassari named as colonel, with Napoleon as third in command. After carrying out half-hearted artillery maneuvers at Bonifacio, Napoleon embarked with 450 volunteers on 8 February 793. Altogether, the assault force on Maddalena comprised 600 men and 4 guns, conveyed in 16 transports escorted by a single corvette. The omens for the expedition were inauspicious from the very beginning. Heavy gales forced the ships back to Ajaccio, so that it was the evening of the 22nd of February before they anchored off the western end of the channel between La Maddalena and the neighboring island of San Stefano. A surprise attack at nightfall was the obvious ploy, but Sassari ruled this out. Napoleon was already despondent. "We had lost the favorable moment, which in war is everything," he wrote. But he stuck to his task. On the 23rd of February, after troops had landed, secured a beachhead on San Stefano and captured the island's fort, he set up a battery of 2 cannon and a single mortar within range of La Maddalena. The 24th of February saw the bombardment commence, and Colonna Sassari promised that the main assault would take place next day. Dark deeds were afoot on the 25th, and even today it is not easy to follow the exact sequence of events. First, the sailors on the corvette appeared to have mutinied and forced Sassari to call off the entire venture, even obliging him to send a formal letter to this effect to Cuenza. But Napoleon, and many later analysts, believe there was no genuine mutiny at all, that this was all part of a preconcerted stratagem between Paoli and Sassari. Certainly the corvette departed with Sassari, leaving behind the message that operations should be abandoned. Hugh Eanes's version of the subsequent events was that he consulted with Napoleon and together they laboriously broke off the shelling of La Maddalena. But on St. Helena, Napoleon accused Cuenza of re-embarking on the 25th without telling him, with the consequence that he and his fellow artillerymen were left dangerously exposed, vulnerable to a sortie from the Maddalena garrison. The one certainty is that the bombardment was abandoned, and that Napoleon and his platoon man-hauled the 1-ton guns through muddy fields to the embarkation point. Their labors were anyway in vain, for only a single ship's boat was sent into San Stefano to take off the men. Unable to retrieve his cannon, Napoleon was forced to spike them. The Maddalena enterprise was fiasco with a capital F and made Napoleon almost apoplectic with rage. It left him with a keen sense of betrayal as a key factor in warfare, and a distaste for amphibious operations which, some say, was the unconscious factor in his ill-considered later plans for the invasion of England. But the immediate effect of the fiasco was to finish Paoli with Napoleon for good. Restless, ambitious, aggressive and treacherous, all the adjectives Paoli applied to the Bonapartes, were exactly the epithets Napoleon now fastened on the savior of Corsica, the man he had worshipped for years. On the 28th of February Napoleon landed at Bonifacio to find that his suspicions of Paoli were shared by the convention in Paris, for on the 5th of February they appointed 3 commissioners to investigate the worsening situation on the island. Leading the deputation was Napoleon's ally Christopher Salisti. But Napoleon had his own deteriorating position to consider, for at the beginning of March, in the Place Doria at Bonifacio, there was an attempt on his life in which Napoleon again claimed to see the hand of Paoli. Some sailors denounced him as an aristocrat and formed a lynching party, which was foiled by the arrival of a group of Napoleon's volunteers. Napoleon became convinced that the sailors were disguised Paulistas, possibly the self-same ones who had fomented the mutiny on board the corvette off Madelna. He decided to beard the elderly lion in his den. He requested an interview with Paoli at the convent of Restino, which turned into an acrimonious confrontation. To begin with, Napoleon tried to soft-pedal, aware that if it came to civil war on the island, the Paulistas were likely to win, the Bonaparte properties then being confiscated and his family reduced to destitution. He urged Paoli not to turn his back on the revolution which had brought him back from exile, and to take the long view of the nation's interests. Paoli spoke angrily of the way the French Revolution had gone sour, how its leaders wanted a subservient, not independent, Corsica, and of how Marat, Danton and the others had forced people in the west of France into open rebellion. Most of all, he said, he was disgusted by the execution of Louis XVI, which for him was the last straw. Napoleon protested that Louis had met his fate deservedly for conspiring with foreign powers and inviting their armies onto the sacred soil of France. At this point, Paoli stormed from the room. The two men never saw each other again. April 1, 793 found Corsica at crisis point. Salisti saw his chance to topple Paoli and become the #1 man in the island. He opened a formidable propaganda campaign against the father of Corsica by playing on French suspicions of Paoli's Anglophilia, nurtured by the 20 years' exile after 1769. The convention was irritated by Corsica's ambiguous status, supposedly loyal to France yet paying no taxes, sending no volunteers to fight in the wars, and in a permanent state of anarchy. Salisti kept the pot boiling by insinuating in his dispatches that this state of affairs would never end while Paoli was top dog in Corsica. His initial aim was to get the pro-Paulista volunteer regiments disbanded and replaced by regulars from the mainland, but, although he and his two fellow commissioners had plenipotentiary powers from the convention, the snag was that it was Paoli's writ, not the convention, which ran in Corsica. Accordingly, Salisti and the two commissioners spent 2 fruitless months trying to make contact with their enemy, who hid away in a mountain fastness. Unknown to Napoleon, his brother Lucien had been a major catalyst in the deepening crisis. In March, at the Jacobin Club in Toulon, he denounced Paoli as a traitor who was preparing to sell out to the English. All the evidence suggests that Paoli knew of this denunciation when he met Napoleon at the convent of Restino, but Napoleon did not. On the 7th of April 1793, the Marat faction in the convention decided to summon Paoli to Paris to answer serious charges laid against him by Lucien and others, for soldiers returning from the Madelna fiasco were now openly saying that the expedition had been sabotaged by Paoli, on pain of outlawry should he fail to appear. The declaration was an arrest warrant in all but name. On 8th of April, the convention's formal decree to this effect was promulgated in Corsica, prompting Napoleon to write to Cuenza that this made civil war on the island certain. However, Paoli played the cleverest of clever hands. On the 26th of April, he wrote a dignified letter of reply to the convention, regretting that old age and broken health made it impossible for him to come to Paris. This was calling the convention's bluff with a vengeance. With so many calls on their manpower, they balked at sending the numbers of troops to Corsica necessary to bring the Paulistas to heel. The convention saved face by rescinding the arrest decree and appointing 2 more commissioners from the mainland. The initiative therefore shifted back to Paoli. Irritated at this turn of events, Salisti and the 2 other commissioners already on the island colluded with Napoleon to force a military solution, before their tame colleagues arrived to patch up a peace that would leave Paoli with the spoils of victory. Napoleon's first idea was to bribe the new military commander of Ajaccio, Colon Aleca, to open the gates of the citadel, but he refused. His next project was a plan to visit the Sanguinaires Isles to set up a safe military haven. But before he could implement this, he was warned that Paulistas planned to assassinate him once he left Ajaccio. He therefore stayed on in the town until the 2nd of May. Paoli meanwhile summoned a convention at court to concert measures for the defense of Corsica against the French and their allies. One of the first decisions taken was to proceed against the Bonapartes, expropriate their property and arrest Napoleon. Ignorant of this, Napoleon set out for court, intent on another meeting with Paoli. On the road he was met by his cousins the Arrighi, who advised him that Paoli had intercepted a letter from Lucien to Joseph, making it clear that his denunciation had triggered the virtual decree of outlawry from the convention. Amazingly, Napoleon seemed undeterred by this intelligence and pressed on to Area de Vivaria, where he lodged with the parish priest, another Arrighi connection. Next day he continued his journey and made the overnight stop with another set of relations, the Tusoli and the hamlet of Poggio. On the 5th of May, Napoleon was at Corsacci, trying to persuade some Corsican delegates not to attend Paoli's convention at court, But he was already in enemy territory, for the local magnates were his old enemies, the Peraldis. Marius Peraldi secured the help of the Morley brothers to place Napoleon under arrest. It was lucky for him that he still had many friends and that some of them were resourceful. Two of them, Santo Rixai and Visavona by name, cooked up an ingenious plan and persuaded the Morleys to bring their prisoner to Visavona's house for a meal. Once there, they spirited Napoleon away down a secret staircase to a waiting horse. He and Santo Rixai then made their way back to Ajaccio by backtracks, and entered Ajaccio in secret on the 6th of May. After hiding out with his friend Jean-Jérôme Lévy, 3 days later Napoleon was able to secure sea passage to Macanagno, from where he traveled overland to Bastia. In Bastia he was reunited with Joseph, Salisti, Lacombe St. Michel and the principals of the anti-Paulista party. After 2 weeks of plotting and preparing, the conspirators sailed from St. Florent in 2 ships with 400 men, and a few guns. Ironically, on the very day of departure the Bonaparte house in Ajaccio was being sacked by the Paulistas, and their farms gutted. Letizia fled with her daughters and hid in bushes near the ruined tower of Capitolo, across the bay from Ajaccio, while the Paulistas looked for them. Once again Letizia experienced the pendulum of fortune and was forced to become a fugitive. A week later the ill-fated expedition anchored in the Gulf of Ajaccio but was fired upon by the fort. Since only 30 people rallied to their standard in Ajaccio, the coup was abandoned next day. Napoleon meanwhile had landed at Provençal on the 29th of May, and made rendezvous with his refugee family, getting them by longboat onto a 3-masted xebec, which took them to Giralda. Letizia remembered making yet another of her perilous night journeys before being united with her family at Calvi. Napoleon himself arrived there disconsolately on the 3rd of June. Calvi was in friendly hands, but was being blockaded by the English. 8 days later, after enjoying the hospitality of the Giubiga family, the entire family embarked for Toulon, virtually penniless. They risked capture by the British by taking passage on a coaster navigated by a noted blockade runner. Pauli's triumph was complete. To cement it, on the very day of the Bonapartes' departure the Paulista National Assembly declared them to be traitors and enemies of the fatherland, condemned to perpetual execration and infamy. Pauli's success, in socio-economic terms, meant the triumph of the mountain folk, the shepherds and the peasants over the great landowners, the nobility and the bourgeoisie of the ports and cities. Most of those who fled into exile with the Bonapartes were merchants or landowners. The paradox was that Napoleon the Rousseauist revolutionary was from the viewpoint of social class more reactionary than the counter-revolutionary Pauli. The French still maintained a precarious toehold in Corsica, for they still held a few towns and villages, and Commissioner Lacombe St. Michel stayed on to encourage them. Pauli's triumph was short-lived. Fearing the inevitable French invasion to restore their position on the island, he ended by inviting the British in. When Admiral Hood anchored at San Fiorenzo with RZ.000 troops, Pauli added his 6,000 men and proceeded to besiege the French in Calvi and Bastia. In June 1794 the Council of Corsica, with Pauli at its head, proclaimed perpetual severance from France and offered the crown to the King of England. George III accepted and sent out Sir Gilbert Elliot as viceroy. Pauli, who was officially in retirement, still wanted to be the power on the island and, not surprisingly, soon quarreled bitterly with Elliot. The British, tired of his prima donna-ish antics, hinted broadly that Pauli might like to retire to England. Pauli hesitated, saw France still in the grip of anarchy, and then thought of the possible consequences of war with both France and England. He accepted the offer. His victory over the Bonapartes was therefore a hollow one. His loyal ally Pozzo di Borgo left Corsica for a diplomatic career that would eventually find him in the service of the Tsar of Russia. What is the explanation for Napoleon's violent split with Pauli? The cynical view is that he realized that there was no future in Corsica for an ambitious young man, that Pauli had already snatched anything that was valuable in the way of power and prestige, and that the glittering prizes were to be found only in France. The conventional view is simply that both men backed different horses in the Corsican power struggle, and thus ended up as enemies. An additional factor was Pauli's personal dislike of the young man. Another view is that when Napoleon became a Jacobin he lost his faith in Rousseau, and came to despise him, but it was Rousseau's social contract that had inspired his original visionary view of Corsica as a society of Spartan simplicity, civic virtue, social equality, poverty and nobility of soul. Simultaneous with his loss of faith in Rousseau, and possibly a contributory factor, was the extreme factionalism and infighting in Corsica in the early 1790s, which Napoleon witnessed at close quarters. As Masson put it, just as France had made him Corsican, so Corsica made him a Frenchman. Yet it seems unlikely that it was merely the contingent circumstances during February-March 1793 that turned the Paulista Napoleon into Pauli's enemy, or that a negative attitude to the Bonapartes alone could have turned off such an oil gusher of adulation as that from Napoleon to Pauli. The psychologist C.G. Jung has warned us that lightning conversions are seldom that, and even coined the word enantiodromia to describe the process whereby Saul becomes Paul, not, on this view, through seeing the light on the road to Damascus, but because the experience crystallized a process of gradually dawning illumination. If Napoleon's violent breach with Pauli had in fact been brewing for years, we may ask another question of more general import. Was Napoleon simply boundlessly ambitious, in the way Brutus hinted Caesar was, and was his ambition an irreducible and dominant psychological factor in his makeup? Or was his ambition a more complex manifestation reducible to other factors, which in turn might give us the clue to the deep dynamic of the quarrel with Pauli? The key may lie in two apparently insignificant remarks. To one of his close friends, Napoleon once confided that at some time in the Corsican period, he had surprised Pauli having intercourse with his godmother, and in the anti-Pauli essay he wrote in July 1793, Le Super de Beaucaire, he said that Pauli's greatest fault was that he had attacked the fatherland with foreigners. By uniting Corsica to France in 1790 without thinking through all the implications, he had in fact lost any chance of an independent Corsica. We may, then, reasonably infer that Napoleon was deeply worried about three things: illicit sexual relations, the attempt to fuse Corsica and France, and the idea of a fatherland invaded, since it is a commonplace of psychoanalysis, confirmed in hundreds of case studies of neurotics, that concern about the fatherland really indicates concern about the mother, and we know in any case of Napoleon's ambivalent feelings towards Letizia, it seems reasonable to assume that Napoleon's antagonism towards Pauli was, at the unconscious level, something to do with his mother. And since Pauli was consciously acknowledged by Napoleon as a father figure, it is clear that what needs further investigation is what depth psychologists would call Napoleon's paternal image. There seem to have been four paternal images significant in the mind of the young Napoleon: of Pauli, of his actual father Carlo, of Louis XVI, and of the Comte de Marbeuf. At any given moment, the association of father could have been to any one of the quartet. The role of Marbeuf as protector of the Bonapartes needs no further elucidation. Moreover, on returning from France on his first leave, Napoleon bracketed Marbeuf with Carlo when he expressed sorrow that he had lost the two significant older men in his life. We have also noted Napoleon's uncertainty how to respond to Louis XVI, the father of the nation to whom he had taken oaths of loyalty. The flight to Varennes did not alienate Napoleon, and in Paris in 1792 his dominant emotion during the two savage mob eruptions into the Tuileries were sympathy with the king rather than fellow feeling with the crowd. The ambivalence Napoleon felt for Carlo was mirrored in his uncertain attitude to Louis XVI. He was partly for the revolution against all kings, but partly for this particular king against this particular mass of revolutionaries. What finished Louis for Napoleon was when he became convinced that the monarch had called on foreign powers to invade French soil. The quartet of father figures all represented men who, in Napoleon's mind, were betrayers. Whether or not Letizia and the Comte de Marbeuf were lovers, and circumstantial evidence overwhelmingly indicates they were, Napoleon certainly thought they had been. This trauma explains so much in his later life, especially his sexuality, his misogynism. The horror he expressed at finding Pauli with his godmother may refer, not to an actual event, but to a transmogrified fantasy, hinting at Letizia's infidelity with Marbeuf. Napoleon's mother complex owes something to the neurotic feeling that he could not be certain who his own father was, even though, as we have seen, Letizia's probable infidelity with Marbeuf had no actual connection with Napoleon, who was certainly Carlo's son. The important thing is that he thought it did, and we surely find an echo of the anxiety in that pithy clause in the later Code Napoleon: investigation of paternity is forbidden. It is very probable that the excessive concern about the union of Corsica and France expressed in Le Super de Beaucaire he helped unite Corsica to France. He attacked the fatherland with foreigners are an unconscious manifestation of anxiety about Letizia's infidelity with Marbeuf, and of anger towards Carlo for letting such a state of affairs develop. The conscious anger Napoleon felt about his defeat by Pauli in Corsica tapped into an unconscious well of rage about quite other matters. Since Pauli was a father figure, Napoleon could discharge his anger about Carlo and Marbeuf onto him. The rage against France as a young man, the violent outburst against the schoolmates who invaded his fatherland at Brienne in the Garden incident, the violent Francophobia in general are all explained on this hypothesis. But, it may be asked, why did the outburst against Pauli take place at this very time? Almost certainly the answer lies with the execution of Louis XVI in 1793. With Carlo and Marbeuf out of the picture, Napoleon's conscious adoration of Pauli coupled with an unconscious antagonism towards him for the sins of the fathers was dispersed for a while as Louis XVI took center stage. In late 1792 the anger against a man who would deliver the fatherland to foreigners was obviously directed by the Jacobin Napoleon against the perfidious Bourbon king. It is a characteristic of ambivalence to divide the love-hate objects so that all negative feelings can be decanted against the Hyde aspect and all positive ones retained for the Jekyll. Put simply, in late 1792 Louis XVI attracted the fire that would later fall on Pauli. When Louis XVI's execution redeemed him in Napoleon's eyes, the undischarged hatred arising from Letizia's infidelity with Marbeuf had to find a new focus, and it was only at this precise time, January 1793, that Napoleon attached himself to France in a decisive and unambiguous way. It is sometimes overlooked by those who regard the breach with Pauli as purely contingent and political that Napoleon made common cause with Salisti and the anti-Paulist faction before the breach was inevitable. In any case, once Louis XVI was dead, it made sense, at the unconscious level, that Napoleon should rid himself of the one remaining figure so that he could become the father. In symbolic terms, his infantile Oedipal fantasies were now partly assuaged. These had become exacerbated into a mother complex by the conviction that, though Carlo denied Letizia's body to his son, he had allowed it to other men. It must be stressed that by falling out with Pauli, Napoleon lunged into disaster, losing all his family's property without any good reason for thinking that he could retrieve the Bonaparte fortunes. From the point of view of rationality and self-interest, Napoleon's opposition to Pauli in early 1793 makes no sense at all. Yet one of the reasons historians have so violently debated Napoleon for and against is the conviction that Napoleon, with his great intellect, must always have had sound reasons for his actions. An examination of the dark recesses of the Napoleonic psyche shows that this is not necessarily so, and that self-destructive psychological impulses usually played some part, and sometimes the major part. This was not the last time in his life that Napoleon, pleading ineluctable necessity, res indetta, and there is no alternative, plunged into reckless adventures that defy rational explanation.